Two, one. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Feel Inspired Podcast, episode 53. 53. I'm almost that old as well. Not quite. Thanks so much for joining us. Today's a very special episode. I'm looking forward to talking about this subject. I've got an incredible guest. And as always, I never get to know my guests beforehand because I love to get to know them on the podcast. But for anyone who's new, listening to this for the first time, watching a replay or whatever, my name's Amit Sodha. This is the Feel Inspired Podcast. I'm a dating expert, mindset expert, and I love helping people with every aspect of their life journey. And I wanted to bring this podcast to people to help inspire them on their journey in the same way that I've been inspired some incredible, authors, speakers, videos, podcast hosts myself. And I absolutely love doing this kind of work. So without further ado, I'd love to welcome our Self Esteem Queen. I love that title, by the way. It's going to be one of the best titles of anyone we've had on the Feel Inspired podcast as well. Lisa, welcome to the Feel Inspired
Thank you
podcast.
Thank you.
And we're not just talking about relationships here, but we'll definitely delve into that as well.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, isn't it, that how detrimental I think people pleasing can be for a number of reasons. We will get into it, just I think it's roots from not being happy with who we are. And so therefore we try and mold ourselves to please other people. And then therefore we're constantly in a state of stress because we're always trying to be something that we're not really truly is us, that we enjoy, that we like about ourselves, but we do it just to fit in, to conform, whatever it might be, or to be liked by the other person. So there's a number of different reasons. But before we dive into that subject, firstly, welcome, Lisa, and I'd love to get a little take on you, Self Esteem Queen. So tell us a little bit about you. Where did this title come from, and how did you get into this line of work? Where did it all start from?
Yeah, okay. Well, yes, I work with women. I'm a trauma rehabilitation therapist and self-esteem queen. And it's my personal mission to reduce the proportion of women who are stuck as people pleasers, doormats, stuck in undesirable situations, thanks to rock bottom self-worth, aka self-esteem. And I do that using a range of modalities, mainly hypnotherapy and something called brainwave recursive therapy. And it's in order to help them break free of the trauma of the negative relationships of their past so that they can rewrite their future and cycle break. And the reason I got into this, I kind of fell into this in terms of a career, let's call it a career. Well, this is a career, but you know what I mean. Because if I was just talking to you briefly before, wasn't I? So if I just share with your listeners that I worked for a very large airline for many years, 16 years in total. And I absolutely loved what I did, loved the people that I met and all those sorts of things. And a few years ago, I lost my mum. She had cancer. And she was terminally ill, and they said that she'd got 3 to 4 months to live. And amazing, it was 8 months later that she actually died, but it was 8 months of trauma watching my mum decline and then eventually pass away, bless her. And about a year after I'd lost her, I realized that, well, after I'd lost her, a few weeks later, I went to the doctors and didn't know how to pick myself back up. I didn't have the tools that I needed in order to process what I was feeling. So I went to the doctor. The first thing that they did was give me antidepressants. So I took the antidepressants, which they have their place. They really do have their place. And I certainly wasn't in a place at the time to cope with what I was feeling. So they had their place for me short term. But a year later, I realized that if I were to come off these antidepressants, everything that I was feeling was actually still there. It was like a plaster over the wound. And I was on a flight to Vegas, and I came across, purely by accident, we had this conversation before, didn't we? Purely by accident, that he was a hypnotherapist, and I had absolutely no idea about hypnotherapy. I'd been for counselling before, and worked in the short term. 4 weeks later, I felt back to square one. And this hypnotherapist, I basically begged him, could he help me? Because I felt absolutely lost and just like I could just break down at any moment and never stop crying. And And he was really, really kind. And he did some, what I now know to be some self-esteem work with me. Didn't charge anything. I never also told my husband because I thought it sounded ever so dodgy. I was on this flight to Vegas and I meet this hypnotherapist who did some work with me down route. And then there was really nothing sleazy in it. He was such a lovely gentleman who helped me. Anyway, and then when I came home, I got back on the Monday, and on the Wednesday, my husband said to me, he said, something's really changed. There's been a mindset shift change. So then I felt safe to share what had happened. And then we sought out a therapist in Manchester. I continued my journey. I think I had 8 sessions in total. And to say that it radically transformed my life is just a massive understatement. In terms of lots of things that I mean, I went essentially because I was heartbroken over the loss of my mum. I thought that that was all I was going for when I, sought out the therapist. But there was all these other things that I didn't realize that had been impacting my life up until then. One was I was a massive serial people pleaser because I feared rejection, which I'll come on to in a second, which made me a doormat because then I was not able to put in boundaries. I valued, I was sort of like so dependent on other people and being approved and accepted by them that I was incapable of validating myself. And then that meant that I had these series of behaviors where I wouldn't put boundaries in because I was afraid that they would reject or abandon me, those sorts of things. And then looking back over my life until I had that therapy, there'd been things that happened in my life that had I been able to put boundaries in, look after myself instead of people pleasing everybody else, those things might have panned out in a very different way. So then there's a few other things to the story. I'm kind of trying to get it, cut it down a little bit because I've got many stories to share. But that was the catalyst for I wanted to learn more. I wanted to learn what the process I'd just been through, why it had such a massive radical transformation of me. So I started to study. I joined a course and I studied. I qualified with absolutely no intention of leaving the amazing airline that I worked for. I was extremely happy there, and it was purely to make sure that I never went back to where I just come from. And also I have children, so that I could if I was undoing my behaviors, I wanted to make sure that I could set new foundations down for them as they move forward in their life, so they didn't repeat the cycle of patterns in their relationships like I had up until that point. And then from there I just had, this is how I fell into it. I had one of my husband's contacts on Facebook. She knew what I'd been doing. She asked could I just help her. So that's what I did. I just helped her. She told a friend, could I help a friend? So a friend came, and then it just had this massive knock-on effect that then I was like, well, I need to start charging here because I've got quite a few people who I'm seeing each week in my spare time. And then before I knew it, I was full-time practicing, and then I've learned more and different things as I've gone from there. So that's it in a nutshell, as much as I can possibly put it in my story and how I came into it.
And that's a beautiful story. First and foremost, very sorry to hear about your mum, but I find that for people like us, generally, it's out of great tragedy that launches us into our calling. And you mentioned a particular word which I wanted to touch upon, which was doormat, and I think that's the word I was looking for earlier, actually. And this is probably the biggest side effect of people pleasing, is that you do end up becoming a doormat for other people, but being at their whim and making yourself almost their kind of for want of a better phrase, slave in a sense. I think that may be a bit extreme, but it's probably true. And the other thing I wanted to just quickly mention as well, just the connection between what you were talking about, because I've been even though I read this book years ago and I've read it a few times, but I've been referring this book to quite a few people recently. Dying to Be Me by Anita Moorjani. I don't know if you've ever read it. And she talks a lot about that in her journey, her cancer journey, that a lot of it, when she went through her near-death experience, or probably even post-death experience, actually, to be honest, and then came back, she talked a lot about this. What she realized was that a lot of her life and the reason that this cancer manifested in her body was because of wanting to please everyone else. And this is the way it manifested in her body. So that was the other connection I wanted to make. You were about to say something, so please go on.
Yeah, completely. One of the things that I learned through all my training was the the mind and the body connection, or I call it the brain and the body connection, and how holding onto these things. So when I spoke about before, that when I came across the hypnotherapist on that flight, and I felt I was desperate for help, because I felt like if I just needed to cry and I would never stop if I cried, I was holding on to that emotion because I didn't know what to do with it, because I'd never been shown what to do with it, how to process it, and that makes you ill. And it was making me ill. I had terrible anxiety. I had eczema all over my eyes, which I'd never had eczema before in my whole entire life. I had a massive patch here of eczema, which, interestingly, the minute that I actually went sought the therapist out in the UK, and one of the things that I was really afraid of saying, this was like just over 12 months later, and I'd never, if whatever this thought came into my head, I'd push it out as fast as I could, distract myself, because I just couldn't handle it. And it was that I'm never going to see her again. I'm never going to see my mum again. And I was afraid to say it out loud, because then it was true. And when I went for my therapy and that came out, it was like an eruption of raw pain that I had been holding onto from when I knew that she was poorly and she was about to die. And the minute that that actually came out, which was very, very painful, but the eczema all went. I would never allow myself to cry. I broke down completely in that session with that therapist. The eczema on my eyes went. So I'd been holding on to all that emotion, and it was desperate to come out. And the thing, like particularly with tears, there's cortisol and adrenaline in our tears. So that's the stress hormones. So because I wasn't allowing that to come out, that was creating this inflammation within my body. And it was my body, I always say, it's giving you warning signals, which is what my body was doing in regards to the eczema around my eyes and the patch around my throat. But I never allowed them out because I didn't know what to do with them, and I was afraid with it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And interestingly, when my dad, it was during COVID, his mum passed away, and bless her, she was like nearly 90, amazing life. But my dad, this is where you learn these behaviors. You see, he, and I'm not parent bashing at all, you know, he just did what his parents had taught him, and it had gone on through the generations. But when my dad's mum died, we never saw him cry. We didn't see him for 2 weeks. It completely didn't go AWOL. We were like messaging and stuff like that, but we didn't see him for 2 weeks, and he just disappeared, and we never saw him crying. He didn't want to talk about it and those sorts of things. So when I witnessed that, knowing what I know now, I was like, oh my God, that was me. You know, that was me, because I didn't know what to do with these feelings because I'd never been shown. And that's what's missing, unfortunately, in this society. Because like to cry is like, it's a vulnerability and it's weakness. You know, lots of people think it's weakness, don't they? We don't understand the physical element to it. But I've gone off on a little bit of a tangent, I think, here.
That's fine. We go all over the place. It's fine. This is the beauty of the podcast. We'll go whichever direction you want to go.
I think you were saying about, what was I saying about? Oh, the brain and the body connection. That's right. So like I follow Louise Hay, and you know, are you familiar with Louise Hay? Bless her, she's not here now. But yeah, that's where I learned all this other stuff that I just find fascinating. But once you know it, it's like, well, of course our brain and our body are connected, because our brain is not functioning separate to our body, it's functioning our body. So of course it just all then, you know, makes sense. But prior to this, I never even thought that, oh, what I'm feeling might actually be the reason behind my anxiety, or the reason behind my eczema, or you know, the clients that I see have got chronic fatigue, or you know, all those other things that are going on. And yes, lots of different things could be coming from the suppressed emotions that have never been allowed out, or they've never known how to get them out, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. I mean, you know what? I mean, it's kind of nice, actually. You've gone in a completely different tangent. I think it's important we do tackle some of these things, because it actually does come back to this. People don't realize it, but you know, we sometimes put a headline topic, but actually, when you delve down into the subject, actually it goes in a completely different direction. But I don't know if there's a book by a famous psychologist, and I've forgotten what the name of the book is. I must apologize, but where they talk about firstly the 5 soul emotions. And you mentioned that, like, I define it just ever so slightly differently. So for me, the brain, it is, there is no such thing as brain body connection. It's part of the body, right? So that's the way I look at it. The mind is the conduit between the body and the spirit. And the mind enables us to, for if we didn't have a function of something called the mind, we wouldn't be able to have the spirit within the body, if you know what I mean. It's an affable subject. It's not always easy to put into words that people can understand, but I see it slightly differently, and I see the function of the mind different to what the brain does. But our thoughts are created by our mind. That we can the mind is a creation device. It can, from that, I can choose to think right now, Amit, you're a sexy mofo. And that's just the mind creating that thought. The mind will then translate that into the brain. The brain will create chemicals and translate it into a feeling in the body. And that's how we work and we operate. So I kind of see it slightly differently in the way that I've learned and the way I've been taught. And then there are 5 core emotions when it comes to us being real emotions, the things that we genuinely do need to let out some tears over, and grief being a big one of them, loss being a huge one, and there's 3 others, and I'll have to kind of do a bit of a dig in my brain. But I don't know if that makes sense for you, or you kind of sort of kind of concur with that.
Yeah, completely. I mean, I say it in a brain and body connection.
Yeah,
Get it. But yeah, you're quite right. I'm being simplistic there, but yeah, there's a little bit more to it. But yeah, completely. But the other thing is that with trauma, so trauma that is experienced, like my background, even though adore my mum, adore my dad. My mum, she suffered with manic depression when I was growing up, when my parents divorced when I was 11. And she really didn't cope very well. And unfortunately, that came out. She was very physically violent, emotionally, mentally violent, is that the right word? Emotionally, mentally abusive, that's the word. So I actually suffered quite a traumatic childhood from the ages of 11 until she actually had a stroke when she was 18, when I was 18. And the thing with trauma is that it changes a person's actual pathways, the way it looks within the brain. So yes, when you say about I can choose, I'm a sexy mofo, those sorts of things, yes, completely. There's an element where we do have choice, but there's also an element where we don't have choice because of past related trauma. So the people pleasing and those sorts of things, it like changes your whole brain structure, basically, trauma. So the people pleasing and those sorts of things came for me as a result of that time, because my mum would take love away. That was one of the things that she would do. I actually witnessed it before my parents divorced. Whenever they fell out, my mother, she would get the lounge chair and go and put it in the kitchen, which I find really funny now. But at the time, and the things that I learned about that was she would cut herself off from him. They wouldn't speak for days, and it was that mum took love away when she was not happy. So as a result of that, I learned that in order to maintain relationships, then you have to conform and keep the person happy, as well as the trauma that came after for me as well. But it can come from many other areas. I mean, I'm talking about trauma, but it can come from societal. If you think about when, we send our children to school and they're being trained to be compliant. Yes, to a point, because you've got to have some sort of order, haven't you? But if you think about how that all works, that's conditioning children to be compliant, to people please. And like my daughter, she gets the class get they put marbles in a jar and then they get a reward at the end of it. So it's like, which I get what they're doing, but from the work that I do, sometimes like no, this needs to stop. But anyway, and then the other thing is, like, what do you witness? Like, it can be mimicked and learned behavior from your parents. My husband's parents, his mum is, how can I word this? She's quite volatile.
Careful, he might be listening.
A little bit volatile. She's Spanish. Maybe that makes sense. She's a spicy Spanish woman. Let's call her that. And his dad is very placid and patient, and what my husband has witnessed is to always keep mum happy. So, it can come from, there's no trauma in terms of his, like mine, but what he has witnessed, what he's learned, he's then learned to mimic that behavior. And then the other that I said about, was love ever taken away when you displeased your parents? So that's where it can come from. But it's the trauma that changes your brain structure, if that makes sense. I've gone off on a tangent again. I apologize.
Don't apologize. No, I love it. I love it. This is fascinating. I think we've gone in a beautiful direction here.
But the thing, obviously I know what you do, and the thing that I wanted to come on and try and make a difference for people is that when you show up as yourself in relationships, so when you're back out on the dating scene, or you're just starting on the dating scene, those sorts of things, people can fall into the trap of people pleasing because they don't want to be rejected. And actually, what you do when you people please, so this is regards to dating, but this is regards to all your relationships. The moment that you start to people please, you are obviously not showing up as yourself, but it makes your relationships dishonest, completely dishonest. And then that can lead to resentment as well. So, in long-term relationships, I've had so much therapy, so I feel like I'm not an idiot, and horrible person, but I'm okay to speak my truth now. Those sorts of things. I'm not people pleaser. If I don't want to do something, I'm okay to say those things. If I don't fear the rejection anymore. But my husband's not quite there, and it can lead to resentment. And sometimes I'll say to him, like, why didn't you just tell me? Just tell me. I don't know that unless you tell me. I want to work with you on that, but I don't know unless you actually tell me. And he's festering about it. And then it might come out in like crossword. I'm like, if you'd have just told me, that was fine. So it can lead to the resentment and frustration and anger that never needed to be there in the first place. So that, I'm talking like long-term relationships there. But yeah, turning up as yourself when you're out dating is incredibly important, because then you pick and attract the right person for you. These patterns can repeat themselves throughout your whole life. So to break that cycle, something's got to change. And if you are a massive people pleaser, then I invite you to start thinking, well, hang on a minute, I'm not fearing rejection. I'm not going to fear rejection from you. I actually might reject them. Go into it like that. Are they right for me? Instead of it all being, are they going to accept me? Does that make sense?
Oh God, it makes perfect sense. And let's rewind a second, actually, because before we could, no. Honestly, I'm just as a recap for everyone listening. Don't ever say sorry. This is come on. This is what we're doing here. And so rewinding back to something you said earlier. You talked about children and compliance, because actually I'm so glad you touched upon this, because this is it's not the first time I've heard this. I've read different books about the subject as well, where the compliance and the people pleasing begins, and it is in the classroom. The funny thing is, if I look at myself just for a second as an example, I've actually turned into a very rebellious spirit now. If I were to go back into full-time employment, I would really struggle to be compliant, for want of a better phrase, right? Because I don't want to go into an environment where I cannot speak my mind. If something pisses me off, I just want to say, fuck you, that's pissed me off, right? I want to be able to be honest about it and not feel the fear to do it, or fear there's any repercussion of doing it, because I would rather have people working for me who says, Amit, that's a shit idea. You know what? Let's go somewhere else. Let's go in a different direction. I'd rather that than, for myself or for anyone else, if they're going to work for me, that they can speak their mind freely, and we could discuss it as well. I mean, I'm not going to take offense to it. I'd rather just someone be honest with me. If an idea I've come up with or something is shit, I'd rather someone just tell me than it's not. But we have taught this compliance culture where you have to, compliance is even a department in most companies, right? We have taught this culture where people have to conform, do what other people say. Otherwise, what's the consequences? That they're angry, displeased, there could be repercussions and so on and so forth. So it's a reinforced part of our culture. So I get, for anyone listening to this, what we discuss here today, it's not necessarily an easy thing that you could just undo like this. But possibly when you were young at some point, you were taught that if you do what I say,
mm,
I'll be pleased. If you don't do what I say, I won't be pleased, and there'll be
mm,
repercussions.
mhm,
And therein was the genesis of
mm,
people pleasing.
mhm,
And that's not to say that's a bad thing,
mm,
because I think part of that is also wanting to serve others. So there's
mm,
an element that which is a good thing.
mhm.
But if you're doing it, which is not part of your conscious choice
Mhm.
of
Yeah,
serving someone else because you
yeah.
want to, then I
Mhm.
think that's where we hit the danger ground, don't we?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, completely. And that's what I'm talking about, really. And sometimes you do, like you just said, with work and stuff like that. Sometimes you have to play the game. If that makes
Mm,
sense. But if that's to a point where it's you can't honour your boundaries, you're being asked to work later than you're actually contracted. That silly old expectation that seems
yeah.
to be out in the corporate world. All those sorts of things. Then and it's affecting and impacting you. Well, then that's the time to think, well, what could happen here, or what needs to happen to change these sort of situations. But yeah, you're quite right. It's that societal sort of pull on people is it's strong. It's a strong thing, isn't it? And it's hard to
Yeah.
sort of like fight against, if that's the word. But like the I suppose the greatest your greatest superpower of this is to learn to accept yourself. And when you learn to accept yourself, that allows you then to start saying no, because you don't then fear, like I just spoke before, you don't fear the rejection from other people. You start to look at things differently and think, well, actually, are you right for me? And that's where you then start to reject other people. Your friendships change. Maybe your work needs to change. Those sorts of things. So that is your greatest superpower, to get without as much as you possibly can on your own, without intervention like me, because not everybody needs. You can get so far on your own. And mine had a trauma background to it, and not everybody has that. But if you start to learn to accept yourself, even the parts that you don't necessarily like I am not perfect, but I'm okay with that. That's okay. Nobody's perfect, yeah? But there's lots of things that I like about myself, and I'm, happy with where I'm at now. But prior to all the work that I had, it was almost like someone might discover some hidden flaw against me, those sorts of things. Or inside, I felt like a bad person. Don't feel like that anymore. And then that means that I behave very differently. And that's because I accept myself whole, completely, every part of me, like even down to like the trauma I experienced. I used to feel like I was inferior to other people who hadn't experienced trauma. So then when I went into relationships myself, I felt inferior to people because I'd got this traumatic background that I would fear abandonment. I didn't recognize it back then as abandonment, but I would get really upset and fear this abandonment of people, well, my partners and those sorts of things. So then I would behave in a different way, but then I've always put them on a pedestal because they hadn't had trauma in childhood. Does that make sense? I felt like I was less
Mm,
a person to them. I don't anymore. That's all completely gone. And it makes you very powerful then, because it's like, well, I mean, I would rather no one go through what I went through, but at the end of the other side of it is these are the character building things, aren't they? And I actually wouldn't change it now because of how I'm able to help my clients and lots of other reasons as well. But I only came to that place when I learned to accept myself.
yeah. So I think that's you summed it up very nicely there, I think. And the one thing I was going to add on to what I said earlier was just this idea of notion. As you talk about it, as we talk about an NLP, this kind of competence, the 4 modes of competence, right? And it's the being at a stage of self growth where your compliance is through competence and competent choice. That is, work, yes, you do comply because you're there serving. It's your job. You're paid to do that. That's what you're there for. But when you're in a situation like dating relationships, this is where actually you come into your own. You can then actually exercise who you
Yeah,
really are.
yeah,
And actually, it's to your benefit as well to be in a position where we don't say yes, don't say yes please and thank you for the things that we don't want to say it for. Well, okay, that's just kindness, right? But you kind of get what I mean. And I think that a lot of people do that. It's one of the things I talk about with guys and the nice guy syndrome, and why it's a bad thing, and also it comes from a not very nice place. I think a lot of people don't realize that. So just to elaborate, any guy who comes to me and says I'm a nice guy, and I'm meeting anyone and I'm like, okay, what is it you want? And I want this. Well, the thing is, if you're a lot of stuff is hidden in the nice, and it's not said, it's buried in there. But because you're hiding it, it almost comes across as deceptive. And people are intuitive. It will come, they'll pick up on that. And this is why the niceness for me is one of the lowest places you can be when it comes to human relationships. And the relationship and dating dynamic. You've got to be a little bit, learn to be forthright, say what you want, be clear about it, clear about who it is you are. Be anything but nice, be mysterious, be playful. What about all these other facets of your personality? Where did they suddenly go when you go on a date? Where's all this jovialness that you are with your friends? Where's all this boisterousness or craziness or one of the lads type of mentality, or that ping pong banter that we all love? Where does that all go? And I think people don't get that, and a lot of that niceness comes from that people pleasing element. Agree or disagree?
Completely agree. Completely 100% agree. I was so, I think I said it before, so dependent on being approved by other people. I was so nice in situations when the person did not deserve me to be nice. And people will take all that you have to give. That's just human behavior. Those are, if you're not showing them how to treat you, then they'll treat you what they think, basically. But also as well, if you're not sticking up for yourself, nobody else is going to do that for you. You have to do that yourself. Stop being nice. That's what I would say. I don't mean that as in turn into a narcissist.
Don't be a monster.
Yeah, I'm not talking about that, but sort of like view it that stop being nice. So the more I was mistreated, the nicer I would become. And I would sit and think, why do people do this to me? I'm so nice. I was really nice. I still am nice, but I will stick up for myself now. This is the difference. I'd be like, oh my God, all that I do, I would run around. I was frazzled, looking after other people, putting out fires all over the place, no boundaries, taking on other people's crap, all that sort of stuff to make their life easier. No one was ever there for me. And I'd be like, why is this happening to me? Even down to my own members of my family would mistreat me. And I just had all this trust and faith that, well, I know how to treat them and I wouldn't do this to them. Why would they do it to me? And I would excuse their behavior because I didn't want to go into confrontation with it or call it out, or, didn't actually want to wake up either, because that what they were doing wasn't very nice, because they were my family. I was like, surely they wouldn't do it. I've got it wrong. I'm being too sensitive. I would take it, internalize it, and it must be something to do with me, which is really common for anybody that's watching, that you do that, because then you can change you. We all know we can't change anybody else, but nothing to do with me other than I was being too nice. Sometimes you have to go, I'm not quite comfortable with that. And that's not okay with me. No, I'm not going to do that. I don't want to do that. I like to do this instead. Or I can't help you with that right now. Could you ask somebody else? If you cannot do those things, you are going to be trampled over. You are. Because if you think about it like this, you're trampling over yourself. So you're teaching other people to do the same, basically, that you don't matter, because you are telling people that you don't matter. I'm getting a bit passionate now.
I love it. It's like I've got to be careful what I say so I don't reveal any identities, but like someone I'm speaking to, they where they work in a very corporate environment, and they're telling me the stories of how and I've even heard it firsthand sometimes as well, where they're working in this environment, and there are some people who are very kind of like outspoken but very aggressive in their approach, or they're just not very pleasant to work with, right? And they seem to be able to get away with it no matter what they do and how they behave. And this individual was telling me, like, I'm so nice to people, and yet people just like, of all the challenges I get at the office when people come to me and say this or do that or whatever it is, And yet, the slightest thing I put wrong, that's
Yeah.
it. People are on me like I don't know, like a moth to a flame kind of thing, right? But
Mm.
when the nasty people are there doing what they do day in, day out, that's tolerated and that's okay. That's perfectly fine. And that's just like been taken as their status quo, normal behavior, and they're allowed to get away with it.
Yeah.
I'm the nice person. I put 1 foot wrong. That's it. People, are on me like, oh, they were suddenly quite rude. Where did that come from?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And that's the other part of this as well, that
Mhm.
it sets an expectation of behavior,
Yeah.
so that when longer term, as soon as
Mhm.
you resort to or return to who
Yeah.
normally are, you will be people will tell you, they'll say, oh, where did this come from? That's not normally you. But it was, but because you didn't show it in the beginning, they're
Yeah.
like, where did that come from?
Yeah. I always say, like, I mean, those sort of instances, we've all been in that instance, haven't we, at work, where someone their behavior is so inappropriate, and no one will dare challenge them
Yeah.
because they're afraid of them and they're afraid of the outcome, the
Oh
confrontation,
yeah.
all those sorts of things. And then you've got the law to navigate round as well, haven't you? So,
Mhm.
that's why those sort of situations perhaps come about. But like, one of the things that I always talk about is that the more that you mark your boundary, so first of all, you have to know where your boundary is, what is comfortable to you, and your boundary is what is it's personal to everyone. So, like, I used to think I'd ask for people's sort of opinion and approval. Do you think it'd be all right if I say this to them? Does that sound all right? Because would you be all right if they did this? Or would you be all right if I said this? I was like, well, I don't do that anymore, because now I'm like, but that's not okay with me. And that's just the end of it. So no, I'm not doing it. Or the answer's no, or I'm going to need to have a word, or whatever. So I don't seek anybody else's approval for my own boundary, because I now know it's completely my own personal thing. But the more that you mark your boundary, you uphold your boundary, and sometimes you have to go into you have to what's the word, confront it. If someone crosses that boundary, you have to bring them to it and say, well, this is where my boundary is. You've crossed over that line and I'm not okay with that, and this was the consequence, so now I've got to follow through on this consequence. The more that you do that, and the less that you keep trying to people please, the more actually that you avoid that situation of walking on eggshells. The person might explode at any time. What am I trying to say? The more I've marked boundaries, the less conflict I run into now. If that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. And that kind of transitions nicely on to what does someone do if they've ever become self-aware that they are people pleasing, or they've been aware of it for a long time, but they just don't know how to get around it, or they are, that's all they've known basically is this behavior, because as we alluded to earlier, it could be a childhood thing, things that stem
Yeah,
something that stem from
yeah,
childhood.
yeah.
And so taking a look forward, if someone is listening to this and they are someone who thinks or feels like they're not being themselves, they do people please,
Mhm.
what can they do to
Yeah,
start the process and start the journey to people please, for want of a better phrase?
yeah. Okay. Yeah. I love this one. Delay. So when somebody asks you something and your knee-jerk reaction is to go yes, or to go into that sort of people please sort of behavior, rabbit in the headlights. Okay, yes, I'll do whatever you need me to do. Delay, yeah, is a really powerful tool. It's something I still maintain to now. You don't have to give a response there and then, okay? No matter what somebody's asking or an expectation of you or anything like that, you don't have to respond there and then. So delay, and make a promise with yourself that you will delay. So anytime anyone ever asks me anything, still now, I always delay. And then I go away, because those moments where you come away and think, oh, why didn't I say this? Those sorts of things, or I could have said it like that, or I could have said this. That gives you the chance to do that. It gives you the chance to do that. So go away and give a response of, I'm going to come back to you on that. I just need to check your diary or whatever. I just need to let me come back to you on that one. That's my favorite go-to. Let me come back to you. I'll send you a message tomorrow or whenever. Don't make a promise actually when you'll send it. I'll send you a message about that. So delay. Then you can go away and ask yourself, does this Do I have time for it right now?
Mm.
If the answer is no, well, there's your answer. Then you need to be saying no. Will this like the way I measure it is I've got a family. We've got 3 children. It's a very busy household here. You know, I work. My husband works. So whenever somebody asks me something, I'll come away and I think, if I say yes to that, does that take me away from those people? So these are people who are most important to me. Back in the day, I'd have done it anyway, taken them with me, dragged me here, there, and everywhere. Now I'm like, no, they need me. And it's sort of like, that's my benchmark. That's my own personal benchmark, if that makes sense. And then send a message. You don't have to do it face to face. You know, people pleasers don't like confrontation. They don't like conflict. And it's sometimes there's this terrible thing where you think you've got to go and have a word in person, that expectation. No, you don't. You know, you can send a message, release yourself from that pressure. Just send a message, but don't apologize. Don't justify. Just say you can't commit to this right now, or whatever it is. Yeah, the no. And then also as well, don't take responsibility, because you are not responsible for the way other people think and feel and what they expect of you. That is not your responsibility. So release yourself from that. The other thing as well is you could start journaling. You know, that's been another game changer for me. You could start like reflect on the people who matter to you in your life. Maybe write about how they've impacted your life and how you've impacted their life. So you start to shift that, perception of where it's all about other people, and you realize what you're bringing to the table. What would you say to your 8-year-old self? You could, in this situation, you know, you could write about that. Accept your flaws. I think I said that before. Practice positive self-talk, which is what you alluded to before when you were saying about I'm a sexy mofo, you know, those sorts of things. Very powerful. It's very powerful. Your brain does not know that you're not a sexy mofo. You know, if you're telling yourself that, then it will believe it, and it will, like you said, release those chemicals and those sorts of things and act that you are a sexy mofo. So practice positive self-talk. You could say something like, I'm a good and caring person. That's what, you know, I tell myself. And then if you realize that you struggle with those sorts of things, just those things, then I urge you to seek professional help, because this has a pattern that is throughout your life that will impact your relationships, not just your love relationships. I'm talking relationships with your parents, with you know, relationships with friends, neighbors, lots of different things. It really impacts every area of your life, and getting rid of that has been a game changer for me.
Yeah. So let's just kind of summarize those steps. And I love the first one I thought the first one was the most powerful one there, delay. I love that as well. Because that's in fact, that is probably one of the key traits of being a people pleaser. You'll respond instantly, right? And not even just a moment's consideration, but you'll just say yes. And then you'll go away thinking, why on earth did I just say yes? I really hate myself for saying yes, like you said, right? And that's a big one. So what were the key things there? So delay.
Don't take responsibility for the way other people think and feel. Accept your flaws. Practice positive self-talk. Oh, and journaling. It was journaling.
Lovely. There you go. Five powerful steps for anyone to take away. But I do love this idea of delay, and I think that that's quite a more powerful skill than, you know, anyone would probably kind of acknowledge at first.
Yeah.
But just giving yourself a moment to think before you answer as well. It's like that old Viktor Frankl quote, you know, between stimulus and response there is a gap, and it's finding that gap and also creating that gap. And you know, it's something I'm guilty of. I've done it in the past as well, where I've just responded as Amit, come on my podcast. Yes, when? Right now. Oh, do I have to? I mean, I've got a few things like, do you know what I mean? You know, it's very easy to do, but I think it's a very, very powerful thing. And I guess now, from the context of relationships and dating, what's been your experience? What's been your kind of key takeaways from anyone that you've seen or spoken to who's been in that boat when it comes to especially dating relationships, who found themselves in that situation where they just struggle to say no or be themselves, or just will show up and, you know, do whatever. And I guess part of that is the mindset that someone's going to like me if I do everything they say, or agree, or even agree with everything they say. And that's a big one, actually. That's a really subtle one, isn't it? Agreeing with what everyone else says. rather than turning it into a playful conversation about something you disagree with, but
Yeah.
you agree for the sake of agreeing.
Mhm.
So what would you say to someone who's in that boat, that they're doing it in that context, and is there anything else specifically for them that they can do to help them on their journey?
So people who are just starting out dating, do you mean?
Dating, relationships in general, people who are single, and maybe they've just got back out there after being out of the game for a couple of years, but it's a trait that they're aware of, that they are a little bit of a people pleaser. What can they do?
Yeah. So all those 5 tips that I just gave, definitely, check those things out and realize that if you the things that you want out of a relationship, you're only going to get and you'll attract a certain person when you show up as your true self. And that goes for everything. We'll know this when being in business. It's, showing up as your true self attracts the person that you actually want, because then you're being honest. So the person who actually wants the whole of you when you're showing up as you is the person that you actually want, not this other person who tries to, doesn't approve of certain things, and you try to change yourself to fit and mold with what your expectation of that they want, and their expectation what they want from you. That's not a healthy relationship. That's not what you want. But you'll only stop getting that if you actually show up completely as you. So that's where changing that, instead of, well, when you're going out dating, instead of, oh, they might reject me, think, I might reject them. Are they right for
Yeah.
me? And that, it's very powerful and very different when you turn up and you show up. I mean, I listened to you were saying about thinking about dating as being fun, those sorts of things. Absolutely, go and think, I'm going to meet this new person now. I loved bloody dating when I was, on the right side of it. But meeting this new person, what am I going to get out of it, rather than, oh my goodness, they might reject me. I'm going to go and going to have a great time. This is going to be fun. And then you show up as yourself with that mindset, because you take that pressure off. And that's very powerful. So yeah, I would definitely say, think about that. In order to get the relationship that you want, the person that you want, the person that accepts you wholeheartedly, then you've got to show who you are, right? And if you show who you are and the person doesn't like you or rejects you, well, they're not right for you either. Yeah.
So true.
It's changing that perception. Perception? Yeah, perception. Reframe. That's what it is.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's exactly a reframe, isn't it? And that one you said, yeah, not will they like me, will I like them as well? It's something I say to people a lot, and it's so true. Just even that one thought, it is a huge shift, because often the people who do people please will use that kind of terminology. They will say things like, I wonder if they'll like me. I hope they like me. All of that kind of stuff, and instead of thinking about it the other way. And I think that's a big part of it as well. I think we've covered some of the basics, but I definitely think this is a topic to delve into more in the future as well. But it's been a wonderful conversation. Is there anything that actually, before we sort of round off, that you think is important for people to know about this subject? Anything that we missed that we haven't mentioned that you want to share? You're bursting to share today before you go.
I don't think so. I think I've gone off on many tangents. Yeah, no, just the go away thing for me is to learn to accept yourself, because the minute that you do that, everything changes, because then you that's where you show up as yourself. You cut yourself some slack, you start to view yourself in a different way, with kinder eyes, kinder words, kinder thoughts. And then when that happens, that's when you start to behave differently. And yeah, anyway, instead of fearing the rejections, you then start to, like I've already said about, you start to think, well, I might reject them. And it's very powerful, that shift. So yeah, I don't think so. I think we've covered everything I wanted to come and talk about.
And of course, I guess that it wouldn't really be, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't ask you one last question about esteem, because I think that's an important subject as well, an important part of this. So what would you say to people who feel that they've got low self-esteem, that they feel their self-value is, or they just don't value themselves that much, or they don't think they're worth anything, and therefore, because of that, they always either attract the kind of person who will use and abuse them, or just people who are just generally not interested in them. But generally speaking, as a whole, for people who feel that they just have low self-esteem, what is a good starting point for them, and what can they do to start lifting gradually their self-esteem?
Yeah. So that is where the journaling comes in. It's amazing because what you do is when you get it out of your head, so what's going round and round in your mind, and you get it on paper, that and you see it rather than like somebody I know used to refer to it as the mind monkeys, and I thought that was amazing. It's true, isn't it? So what the mind monkeys that are being naughty in your brain, when you put it down on paper in your mind, when you put it down on paper, you think, well, that's stupid, isn't it? And it gives you a chance to sort of, you realize actually that's not true and that's not true. And then that what I said before about write about the people in your life who have impacted your life, but how you've impacted their life as well, because then that brings you realize how valuable you are to those people and what you brought to them. But I mean, self-esteem is incredibly powerful, and it does it governs your future pathway. If you don't have, well, both way, if you have great self-esteem versus not having great self-esteem, it maps out your whole future pathway, and that's where it impacts your behavior, because of when you said about self-worth and those sorts of things. That's where you make decisions, you're attracting different people, you accept certain behaviors like I did back in the past, because then it's like, well, I can't get any better, so I need to keep going with this relationship, no one else will have me, those sort of belief systems. And that's coming from that real poor self-esteem. That's how you're viewing yourself, but then how you're putting yourself out to the world. So with something like that, it can leave you, especially with dating, quite vulnerable going out into the world. So maybe you need some healing, and it's a bit of a cheesy word really, but maybe you would benefit from having some healing and looking at that, why that is built the way it is, why you are viewing yourself in the way that you are. Because then I always explain to my clients, like, self-esteem is like your firewall on the computer. So that stops viruses getting in and slowing you down, and bring you to a standstill. Self-esteem is exactly the same. It's, if you've got great self-esteem, it's your firewall to the world, but not in terms of putting the world up, keep everybody out, defensive sort of thing, but stopping people, when people make comments or those sorts of things. It's just sort of like, whatever, it doesn't matter, you don't absorb it. But people who have got poor self-esteem, they absorb it, and it slows them down and changes their behavior and those sorts of things. So yeah, maybe it might be a case that you need some healing to help you get to where you deserve to be, to attract the things that you want to have.
Definitely. I think that's a good way to round off what you said. And then, of course, if people do want healing specifically from you as well, where can they reach out to you? Where can they find you?
Yeah, you can find me on Facebook. I've got a business page, but I love people coming and connecting with me directly. So just search me out, Lisa Arterton, on Facebook. I've also got a group, Stop Being a People Pleasing and Boundaryless Woman. You're welcome to come and join that. Or on Instagram, Lisa Arterton Therapy.
Lovely. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on board as well. I know you were a little bit nervous today because, like, oh, you basically admitted you were just starstruck with me, weren't you?
Oh, absolutely, completely. It's a sexy mofo,
Exactly. No, it's been a real pleasure. And for anyone who's kind of catching the tail end of this as well, do not worry. The replay will stay up on all social media channels, of course, and the audio will be available on all past podcasting platforms by tomorrow as well, so you can listen to it in your own time over and over again, the dulcet tones of Lisa there and me. It's been a real pleasure having you on though as well, and no doubt we'll definitely dive even deeper than we went today on this subject as well, and even go on even more tangents, which I love. I think that's, for me, is the best thing ever. So it's been a real pleasure, Lisa, and lovely to get to know you as well. And for everyone else out there, thank you for joining myself and Lisa for the Feel Inspired podcast, and I'll be back with my next episode on Tuesday. But thank you again.
Bye.
All right, stay on with me. I'm going to end the broadcast. Ciao for now.